The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. When Pierre Pollievre was elected leader of Canada's Conservative Party in 2022, he vowed to put Canadians back in control of their lives, says Andrew Lawton, author of Pierre Pollievre, A Political Life. Lawton goes on to say, Pollievre took aim at the country's elites and gatekeepers, as well as governments that sneer at their own citizens. The book takes the reader through Pollievre's life, from adoption to his adopted father declaring his homosexuality, his fascination with politics from his teen years, and his brazen and forthright commitment to conservative policies. Lawton says this book showcases Pollievre's unique brand of conservatism, which is galvanizing supporters and detractors alike. What emerges is a portrait of a radically authentic individual who's been plotting to become Canada's Prime Minister since he was a teenager. I invited Andrew Lawton to join me for a conversation that matters about the man who wants to run Canada. Andrew, welcome.
Hey, it's good to be with you, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
This is a pretty extensive book. How did you go about pulling together all these elements of his life? Because you get into remarkable detail about the political clubs that he belonged to when he was in high school and so on. Where'd you get all of this information?
A lot of it was just by bootstrapping conversations with people. You speak to someone about their experiences with Pollievre, and then they mention in passing the name of someone else that you haven't heard of, and then you look them up and get their own story, and eventually you're able to figure out which of these stories were true and which ones have perhaps been subject to the fading tides of memory. But it was very helpful for me because Pollievre has always been so outspoken. He left a very lengthy public record. I was actually able to find letters to the editor he wrote as a teenager, times he had been interviewed by reporters at 17, 18, 19. And it was actually quite, I don't want to say easy because there was a lot of work that went into it, but it was easier than it could have been for some because he left a big trail of breadcrumbs that I was able to follow as a biographer.
What made you take on this project that made you say, okay, Canadians need to have a sense of who we're talking about here because he does stand a very good chance of becoming Canada's next Prime Minister? What was your motivation?
One thing I will point out is that the polling we've seen in recent months that really make that almost a guarantee at this point, I didn't know about because it hadn't come out yet. That wasn't the story when I accepted this project a little over a year ago. The reason that I took it on, I had chatted with my publisher about it, and it came about somewhat organically, and he actually pitched it to me. But I had seen the rallies that Pollievre had during the leadership race, including out in British Columbia, but all over the country, where he would get thousands and thousands of people come out. And this is not normal in Canadian politics. To get someone to wake people up from their slumber and go out on a weekday in the winter, sometimes in the middle of the day, to hear a politician speak is quite a significant thing. So it was clear to me, and I cover Pollievre in my day-to-day work as a journalist and a broadcaster, it was clear to me that he was doing something right. And he was also the beneficiary of a sense of timing that was quite right. And I felt like there was a movement bigger than the man, but it meant that both needed to really be explored as Canadians set to go to the polls next year.
Did you set out with an idea that you were going to like him, or was this a process of discovery?
I already knew a fair bit about him. I've interviewed Pollievre over the years. I obviously covered his rise through the leadership to become the leader and had interviewed him since. So in that sense, I don't want to say I didn't learn things because I did. I learned a lot, but I already had going into it a relatively strong sense of who he is as a person and as a figure. And I would say there are things that obviously came up that surprised me and things that came up that didn't surprise me. But I came at it, and I'm honest about this in the book. Well, the book is rooted in facts. I approach politics from a right-of-center lens. I'm not a partisan. I'm not loyal to a person or a party, but I'm certainly sympathetic to a lot of the issues that motivate Pollievre and his supporters. So in that sense, I didn't come at it with this pure sense of neutrality. But I also think that that perspective opened up a lot of doors. I was able to get access to a lot of the conservative universe that might not have been there for other people.
One of the things that I found quite interesting in reading the book, and in the introduction, I said, his unique brand of conservatism is he really is committed to the principles of conservatism. You pointed out then when he was young, and Ralph Klein was the premier of Alberta. Of course, Pollievre was behind him initially, but then as he started to watch Klein start to get a little too liberal, shall we say, in his spending, Pollievre took him to task publicly. It's a gutsy thing to do, especially if you're a young and up-and-comer within a political party.
Oh, yeah, because at that age, he wants to be helping out on campaigns. He wants to work in politics. He wants to get hired. And while he had a peripheral involvement with the Alberta PCs, he was more loyal federally. He was more involved in what was at the time the Reform Party. But you're right about that. He was criticizing Ralph Klein, who, just for context, is still called somewhat lovingly by conservatives from Alberta King Ralph, because he's like the godfather of Western conservatism of that era. And Pollievre was nitpicking on, oh, well, he didn't cut that, he was spending that, he was saying he wasn't conservative enough, which even among his peers was somewhat of a heretical view. But it does speak to, I think you're quite right, that sense of just how ironclad his principles were, and almost this purity that he had and expected of others in politics.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. It's clear in reading the book that he also had a very strong relationship with Preston Manning and supported him so much in those early days. And yet, once again, he wasn't afraid to say, okay, it's time that we now move on. It's a gutsy way to be, especially for such a young member of the party.
Yes, and just for people that aren't as familiar with the backstory, what you're referring to there is the period, I forget the exact year at this point, when Stockwell Day was really becoming the challenger, and Stockwell Day then took the leadership of the Canadian Alliance. And this was something that was a very, very nasty internal battle. It really divided friends. I mean, one of Pollievre's friends, Shuvaloy Majumdar, who's now an MP, Majumdar was backing Manning, and he and Pollievre actually had a strain in their friendship because of this, because Majumdar thought that it was a betrayal for people to do what Pollievre did. Poilievre's own girlfriend at the time, Jenny Byrne, who's now in his life as an advisor, she was on Team Manning when Pollievre was on Day. So he was going against a lot of what was popular and what people would have expected him as a guy whose first real political involvement was wanting to join Preston Manning's riding board in Calgary Southwest.
So do you think that he took these stands because they were an opportunity for him to differentiate himself, or is it an adherence to his principles?
I think if you have to pick one or the other, it's the latter. I think that he was following along with what his own moral compass was telling him. I don't know if he was running a calculation at all about, would this hurt my job prospects, or would this be the wrong thing. One thing I'll point out is that he was on basically the winning side of every political battle he ever took up. And I don't think that's necessarily a case of him picking the winner or picking who he thinks is going to be the winner, but it is saying that he's generally been on the right side of these things. When he went with Day, that was when Canadians went with Day. When he went with Harper, that was when Canadians went with Harper, and so on. So I think in that sense, he's just had a remarkable knack for what the right move is at a given time, which I think is also evident later on in his life when he decides not to seek the Conservative leadership in 2020 and instead seeks it in 2022. What a sense of timing that is.
Well, yeah, because when Mr. O'Toole took over the leadership, he wasn't particularly enamored with Pierre Pollievre, and he demoted him within his caucus. And at the time, it would be very easy to look at that and say, okay, this is not the right way that you want to be going. But in some ways, in hindsight, he could say, well, you never know when you're having good luck, because that opened up opportunities for him to express himself in ways where he wasn't as constrained by the party.
Yes, and I think there was also there were two other aspects there. One was that he was and is a fiscal hawk first and foremost. His issue going back to when he was a teen was wanting governments to spend less. And I think in 2022, or sorry, in 2020, this is earlier on in the pandemic, he was looking at the amount of money that the federal government was shoving out the door, no end in sight. I don't think he thought that he could actually achieve a fiscally conservative agenda, let alone campaign on a fiscally conservative platform at that time, had he been the leader. So that was a sense of it. But also one of the things that I unearthed in writing the book that I relay in there is that in 2020, that was around the time that he and his wife were just beginning to come to terms with what I wrote about is his daughter's diagnosis with autism. She's nonverbal. It's quite a severe diagnosis. At the time, it was very early and very fresh to them, and they didn't really know as a family what they were going to do with it. Whereas when you fast forward 18 months to the 2022 leadership race, that had kind of resolved because they had had enough time to sit with it. They had gotten her into a program. And the family aspect, I do think, is probably the largest motivator for him not running in that one race.
But it did unleash him in a way that he was able to start to, demonstrate his own unique voice. He started to become a YouTube sensation. And when you take a look at the video that he produced earlier this year or later last year about the housing crisis in Canada, you go, this is remarkable storytelling. This is somebody who has mastered the art of video communication in a social media environment.
Yes, and that actually started when he was initially the finance critic under Andrew Scheer. So this is going back to 2017. He really found his own. He had always been interested in it. He had uploaded his videos of him speaking about this or that in the House of Commons. But even today, I looked back at most of those videos and they've got like 14 views. These are very boring, dense, dry videos. They weren't promoted in a way. And then you fast forward to 2017 and he really starts to experiment this. And you can see that the way that he describes these things changes. The text that he uses, the capitalization, the language he uses, he's really spicing up mundane parliamentary proceedings and getting thousands and thousands of views of him asking Bill Morneau something in question period or Justin Trudeau. And I think he saw that there was an opportunity in there to communicate with Canadians directly. And it largely influenced the way that he engages or doesn't engage with the media today. He doesn't have to because he's found these ways that he can talk to Canadians without having to have your message mediated by CBC.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. You know, one of the knocks against him is that he's so good at it that he is a polished communicator, and I don't know fully the extent of his understanding or the depth of his knowledge in dealing with complex issues. What's your take on his ability to dig into the weeds on issues?
So it's not even my own perspective that I'll share. It's that's been gleaned from people I spoke to that work with him, where anytime he comes out with a slogan, whether it's axe the tax or defund the CBC or something like that, he has put weeks, if not months or years of thought into that message. Axe the tax is a great example. He can debate up and down the ins and outs of the carbon tax. He knows the numbers. He knows the greenhouse gas emissions. He knows this all because he talks about it when he has to give longer answers. But he knows that all of that will make the average Canadian's eyes glaze over. So instead, he relies on these snappy things that have now just become part of the common political parlance. You mentioned earlier the word gatekeeper. This is a word that is not new, but I hear it discussed in politics now largely because Pollievre popularized the use of that word. It's a term that you just hear in day-to-day conversation now, sometimes as a joke, sometimes ironically, or tongue-in-cheek. But he's done that. So when he uses these slogans, it's not because he doesn't understand it. It's because he knows he's communicating to people that have, in some cases, a very low bandwidth for politics and policy.
You know, you talk about axe the tax, which is a real departure from the way that political discourse had been going in this country for more than 15 years. Mr. O'Toole was moving towards some of his own kind of version of a carbon tax, and that's really when you started to see Pollievre break from him. But considering the zeitgeist of our times around climate and carbon, to say I'm going to go in a direction where I'm going to embrace the idea of axe the tax is a political risk.
So I think there are two aspects of this, Stuart. There's the political and the policy. So let's separate those out for a moment, because politically, the Conservatives in 2021 with Aaron O'Toole did everything that the left has always asked them to do, which is you have to have a carbon tax, you have to have a climate plan. And the Conservatives came out with their own version of a carbon tax, and it was not enough. It was still heavily criticized. So I think politically, for voters that are motivated by wanting a carbon tax, by wanting that sort of a government solution, they've already got options in the Liberals and NDP. So the Conservatives actually, I think, stand politically to benefit by not doing that and by distinguishing themselves. And what's different in the upcoming election compared to 2021 is that cost of living is rampant, grocery prices are rampant, gas prices are higher. So it's a lot easier to point to a carbon tax as being a luxury item, even for people that were supportive of it in years past. The other side is the policy side. And do the Conservatives think that the carbon tax is the most viable vessel or tool to achieve environmental goals? And basically they don't. And what they've pointed to is the fact that emissions have gone up in the time that we've had this carbon tax there. So I don't actually think it's as much a political risk as people think. And the reason for that is because the Conservatives did it the other way last time, and it serves as a pretty useful experiment, so to speak.
You know, one of the other things that I find interesting is that Mr. Pollievre goes, I'm going to axe the CBC as well. But at the same time, he turns around and he praises CBC in Quebec, the French version. What's the difference there? And isn't that a little bit at odds with itself?
Has he praised CBC in Quebec? I'm not aware of the comment you're referring to. I'm not disagreeing with you.
I have been led to believe that he is not critical of what they're doing in Quebec, because he says that's what the CBC was supposed to do, was supposed to build community engagement, to reflect the people that listen to it, that it represents. But that he feels that on the English side, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the CBC is taking on different mandates. And so...
So I haven't heard that comment in that context. What I have heard him say, actually, it was in an interview that I did with him I think it was during the leadership race. I asked him what defund the CBC really meant to him. And I was really trying to get into a granular level that the 3-word policy doesn't convey. And he did say, there'd be some carve-outs for French language programming, and I think he said northern or rural. So he's clearly saying that, yes, there are some areas in which he thinks the CBC does have a place. If I had to extrapolate from that, I think he's talking probably about radio predominantly, not television, certainly not English television, certainly not their website and a lot of their entertainment programming. Now, there has been a bit of debate about when he said what he said about French programming, did he mean French language programming outside of Quebec, where French speakers are a minority, or did he mean Radio-Canada, the Quebec operation? Right. And that I don't know.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. One of the more interesting things is that you point out is the relationship with his lovely wife, Anna, and what an introduction to her on the night that he was took over as leader of the Conservative Party. How important is she to him in his political life?
Immensely so. And I think one of the reasons is just she checks boxes. And I don't mean that in a way that is meant to diminish her skill, but she has an experience that makes her quite unique. She's a Venezuelan refugee. She came to Canada without speaking English. She's now trilingual. She's a young mother. She's had experiences that make her very relatable to people that Conservatives really want to connect to. But she's also incredibly talented and willing to take up this role as the leader's spouse, which is one that has had very different ramifications and I should say manifestations over the year. Lorraine Harper was incredibly media shy. She did not do a lot of public speaking. Sophie Gregoire Trudeau was a lot more prominent, a lot more vocal, had a bit of celebrity going into Justin Trudeau's entry to politics. During the last two elections, Jill Scheer, Andrew Scheer's wife, Rebecca O'Toole, Aaron O'Toole's wife, they were out with their husband on the campaign trail and they did stuff, but they certainly didn't rally the troops like Anna does. So in that sense, I don't even think secret weapon is appropriate now because so many people have noticed her involvement, but she's definitely taking on a far more active role than even Justin Trudeau's wife had, and certainly than previous Conservative leader spouses have.
So you've met him?
I have.
Yeah. Do you like him?
It's interesting you asked that question because I was asked it in an interview before, and I, at the time, realized it's the most difficult question because how I answer affects how people view the biography. I won't hide the fact that I do. I do like him, but it wasn't that my like of him fed into how I approached the book. If anything, it was what motivated me to look at him as a character and as a figure in politics. And there are things in the book that I know the Conservatives will like and things that I know they won't like. But on the whole, I think he's interesting. And he does a lot of the things that I've always, as a commentator, not as a biographer, have complained about his predecessors not doing, which is flip-flopping and equivocating and stuff like that. He's been a lot more consistent, which I think is refreshing in politics.
What do you think that the country would look like starting the day that he takes over as prime minister, should he succeed in the polls?
I think people might get whiplash trying to keep up with him. And I think that one of the big divides between how he'll approach government versus Stephen Harper, say, is that he's going to move a lot more quickly because if the polls are any indication, he'll go in with a majority and not a minority, which gives him a lot more latitude and a lot more of a mandate to do things. And I think he's going to have a lot of people in his party that he's made these big promises to, and he's going to have to show movement on that. So I think he's going to move quite quickly and really hit the ground running, so to speak.
It's going to be very challenging to do, though. You take a look at the expansion of the public service, which is one of his areas of concern. Turning that ship in a different direction will take considerable skill.
It will. And the other aspect that I don't explore too much in the book, but it's one that I've thought about since, is the Senate. There's a Senate that's been overwhelmingly appointed by Justin Trudeau. And while they're nominally independent, they could be the ones that decide to impede a Conservative government's agenda. So there are some things that suggest even if he wins this 200 plus seat majority that polls are showing, it won't necessarily be smooth sailing. You're right.
Final question here. He seems to have really focused on smaller independent media outlets to be his voice to the people. Why has he chosen that path? And do you think that it's wise?
I think it is. I think it's wise in the sense that we are seeing a decline in audience and a decline in trust in the Ottawa media. So the parliamentary bureaus of CBC and CTV and Global, and a rise of independent media, shows like yours, shows like mine, and even like local outlets and ethnic outlets that have incredibly large circulations but aren't part of the Ottawa bubble. So I think he likes these because it lets him connect with ordinary people and local issues in a way, whereas the Ottawa journalists have a track record of only fixating on a couple of things that really don't resonate with what Canadians care about. I mean, you can look at how many questions a Conservative leader will field about abortion in a single press conference, where people in communities across the country, if they had the opportunity to ask the leader or the prime minister a question, would want to ask about the factory in their town that's closing, would want to ask about job loss, about housing, about these sorts of things. So I think in that sense, it's a strategy, but it's also who he is. He's not someone that has this incredible deference to big media as his predecessors have.
Well, he seems to have quite a remarkable amount of charisma and connects with a lot of people. But as you point out in the book, he galvanizes both sides, those who support him and those who really do not like him. So it's going to be a very interesting election as we go into the next year.
Very much so. But again, part of why I wrote the book, it's a fascinating character, and it's not meant to be for people that like him or dislike him. It's meant for everyone. And I think there's something in it for everyone.
Well, I think so too, because I read it and I started to get a measure of who he is as a person, what were the influences in his life, and I see somebody who is, got a broad spectrum of understanding about the society in which we live in, and he's respectful of a wide range of different, lifestyles, beliefs, and on and on. It looks to me like he has the capacity to be a prime minister, from the sense that you're not the prime minister of just the Conservatives, you're the prime minister of all of Canada.
Yeah, very much so. But I think the key is that he can't abandon the people that got him elected in the first place. And that's the tightrope that has really sidelined a lot of Conservative leaders in the past, and will be one for him to walk. He has to keep the base happy while also delivering to Canadians who aren't really as into the culture wars, perhaps.
The tight rope. Tight wire. I can't even
high
say
wire. That was yeah. You made your own little portmanteau there.
Political leadership. Thank you very much, Andrew. This is very, very informative, and thank you for writing the book.
Stuart.